Good morning. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Lee Walton. I am the Dean of the School of Divinity here at Wake Forest University. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the School of Divinity and the program in African American Studies to this symposium in celebration of the 40th year of the publication of Cornel West's classic book, Prophesy Deliverance. Now, it's not often that one book comes to shape, define, and change the trajectory of multiple fields. Prophesy Deliverance, an Afro-American revolutionary Christianity, is one such book. Published in 1982 by a then 28-year-old philosopher. This book constitutes a watershed moment in African American studies, Black theology, and political philosophy. The book wrestles with the specificity of the African American predicament. Prophesy Deliverance, it posited a bold and ambitious aim to establish a mode of thinking, writing, and public engagement that can diagnose and describe Black life toward transforming Black life. As African Americans confront the perennial challenges of self-conception and self-determination, African American critical thought is concerned with the cultural, that's to say the artistic, the spiritual and moral characteristics of a people, as well as the political, the major institutions and material conditions that regulate lives. Thus, in Professor West's words, African American critical thought is, I quote, critical in character and historical in context. It looks back through history to mine the rich diversity of the Black experience while illuminating new insights and identifying old blind spots. Therefore, the book has 5 major tasks that our respondents will discuss today. Prophesy Deliverance offers a genealogical inquiry of white supremacy and the ways that produced and shaped African Americans in the modern world. It reconstructs and interrogates African American responses to white supremacy. It provides a dialogical exchange between progressive Black Christian thought and a critical Marxist social analysis. And in conclusion, the book posits strategic and practical interventions that extend the ongoing struggle for liberation. These are the 5 primary tasks of African American critical thought that each respondent will unpack this morning. But let me say something about the primary sources that inform these tasks. Sources that inform the intellectual, spiritual, and ethical life of our guest of honor this morning. The first source is what so many of you heard him discuss yesterday afternoon with such passion and commitment. The tradition of evangelical Christianity and piety. Professor West refers to this as the most influential and enduring intellectual tradition in Black life. Whether known by the heuristic shorthand of the quote-unquote the Black church, or now more widely accepted and inclusive category of Black Protestant churches, it's difficult to deny the salience of evangelical piety on Black life, Black thought, and Black culture. To be sure, just as there is no singular Black church, evangelical Christianity has taken varying forms in Black life. Evangelical Christianity has animated and inspired those with an eye toward freedom and liberation. And it has also anesthetized those who appear too scared to be free. African American critical thought is informed by the former, the progressive and the prophetic strand of black faith that has constituted a moral conscience for this nation and an expanding progressive moral framework that affirms in its best formations every person, regardless of race, country, class, gender, sexuality, affirming that they're made in the imago Dei and ought to have the opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential. The second source is an American philosophical tradition, best known as pragmatism. Dating back to the post-war context of the late 19th century, figures like Charles Peirce, William James, John Dewey, these philosophers understood philosophy as an interpretation of people's past towards solving specific problems in the present. The assumption that knowledge requires philosophical foundations was as misguided for the pragmatist as theology requiring pure, immutable, orthodox commitments uninformed by time or space. So if Professor West rejects theology that is so heavenly minded that it's no earthly good, he also rejects philosophy that is so academically insular that it has no real world impact on the doings and sufferings of everyday people. This, my friends, is the theological and philosophical work of Prophesy Deliverance. A text that understands prophecy not as simply foresight of the future, but insight into the historical patterns, cultural practices, material conditions, and political structures that both unleash and preclude human flourishing. And deliverance is an ultimate aim, theological concept of deliverance, an ultimate aim of penultimate objectives. It's fostering the ability to engender existential freedom to combat death, dread, and despair, toward moving communities then towards social freedom, challenging the structures and regimes of truth that blunt human personality, whether it be in our schools, economy, criminal injustice system, and even our communities of faith. This is what we're here to discuss today. And to help us in this process, to help us discuss this classic text on the eve of its 40th anniversary, we've gathered together some of the greatest emerging minds in political theory, philosophy, and theology to help us consider the continued relevance of Prophesy Deliverance, as well as ask new questions that we must confront born of developments over the past 4 decades. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. To engage Chapter 1, joining us via Zoom from Nashville today is Dr. Shatima Threadcraft, Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies, Philosophy, and Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Good to see you, Sister Shatima. With acute and insightful vision, and often an engaging womanish wit and wisdom, Dr. Threadcraft's writings demystify the normative gender logics that too often ignore and erase the humanity and dignity of Black women. She's the author of Intimate Justice, The Black Female Body and the Body Politic. Prior to joining the faculty of Vanderbilt, she was professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. Dr. Threadcraft earned her bachelor's from Harvard University, a master's in philosophy and policy from the London School of Economics, and a PhD in political science from Yale University. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Threadcraft.
Thank you for having me.
To engage Chapter 3, I'm going to skip forward to Chapter 3. is Dr. Brandon Terry, currently a presidential fellow, presidential visiting professor at Yale University. Yet Professor Terry is on the faculty of African American Studies and Social Studies at Harvard University. Along with Professor Tommy Shelby, Professor Terry is the co-editor and author of To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., which immediately became the text on the philosophical and political thought of Martin King. Brandon is also the author of the forthcoming The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement with Harvard University Press. Professor Terry, too, earned his undergraduate degree at Harvard College before a master's in political theory at the University of Oxford and a PhD at Yale University in political science. Reflecting on chapter 4 is Wake Forest's own Corey D.B. Walker. Professor Walker is the inaugural director of the program in African American Studies and the Wake Forest Professor of Humanities in the Department of English. He's the author of A Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America, along with another dozen essays and co-edited volumes. Professor Walker has taught at Brown University, the University of Virginia, and previously served as the Dean of the College at Winston-Salem State University. He holds degrees from Norfolk State, Virginia Union, Harvard, and his PhD from the College of William and Mary. And here to engage Professor West on chapter 5 is Dr. Maisha Cherry, Professor of Philosophy at the University of California in Riverside. She is the author of Unmuted, Conversations on Prejudice, Oppression, and Social Justice, and the just recently released The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle. Both of these books are with Oxford University Press. And the latter text, The Case for Rage, has been featured just this past week in both the New Yorker and Atlantic magazines. Please check it out. Professor Cherry has also been featured in a range of other media outlets, from her riveting TEDx talk to BET and her monthly Unmute podcast. She's a proud, very proud graduate of Morgan State University. She holds an MDiv from Howard University School of Divinity and earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Now, not here with us today, who was scheduled to be, to respond to chapter 2, is our dear, dear, dear colleague, sister, Professor Carrie Day, theologian and womanist ethicist from Princeton Theological Seminary. She was going to respond to a genealogy of modern racism. Unfortunately, Professor Day had matters that took precedent with her precious family back in Princeton, and therefore was unable to come join us. But you will still have the opportunity to learn from Professor Day's incredible contributions, because today's symposium is a part of a larger project. We are glad to have Robert Radcliffe. Robert Radcliffe. We are glad to have Robert Radcliffe here with us this morning. Mr. Radcliffe is the editor-in-chief of Westminster John Knox Press, the publisher of Prophesy Deliverance. And Westminster John Knox Press is taking all of our reflections this morning, and in honor of Professor West, is publishing them in an expanded 40th anniversary edition of Prophesy Deliverance. In 2022, that will mark this anniversary as a way to celebrate this groundbreaking work, as well as a tribute to our dear teacher, Professor West. So now we will follow the flow of the book by each chapter, beginning with Professor Threadcraft. Each panelist will speak for roughly 10 minutes or so in order. And then we will allow Professor West to come forth to respond to these reflections, before we will then open it up to some back and forth engagement and reflection among the panelists as well as with you here today. So please receive Professor Threadcraft.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So it's an honor. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you, Professor West, but it's an honor to give comments on your book. So I'm going to talk about this first chapter, American Africans in Conflict, Alienation in an Insecure Culture. And in the chapter, Professor West deftly documents the development, anxieties, and exclusions of Europeans, white Americans, and American Africans as they journey through early, middle, late, and post-modernity. That is, from the Glorious Revolution to the French Revolution, from the French Revolution to the unification of the German Empire, from the unification of the German Empire to the emergence of the United States as the unquestioned supreme world power, and from the emergence of the U.S. To the period in which Professor West writes, 3 decades after the end of European modernity. Now, while early modern culture featured the increasing acceptance of the authority of science, the appearance of a new kind of pagan neoclassicism, and the subjectivist turn in philosophy, the decline of modernity saw a crisis in science, despair in modern paganism, and major attacks on the primacy of the subject. Now, for the Europeans he documents, the chapter reads like classic Scorsese. So it's all fun until the feds come, right? So consider philosophy and even the subject's wild ride in the text. So in the beginning, West says, philosophy became the queen of the emerging scientific disciplines within this new paradigm as a meta-discipline which provided objective and valid grounds for knowledge claims put forward in the newer disciplines, especially physics. Now, this turn in philosophy granted science a monopoly on truth in the marketplace of ideas, to the dismay of both artists and theologians. The emergence of European modernity also witnessed a subjectivist turn in philosophy. And this quest, initiated by Descartes, gave first place to concepts of the subject, the ego or the self, and preeminence to the notion of representative knowledge. The subject, ego, or self constituted the starting point for philosophical inquiry, and mental representation by the subject, ego, or self supply the principal means for subjects to make contact with objects, ideas to copy things, or concepts to correspond to the external world. But by the end, not only are the most precious ideals of science, politics, and the arts radically called into question, but there are also major attacks on the primacy of the subject. Now, Professor West's analysis of our postmodern period feels as fresh as ever, and I think prescient really. And I was particularly taken aback by his take on the state of the sciences. So he says, the crisis in science, which emerges in European modernism, is now becoming a more widespread crisis in the authority of science, in many ways similar to the crisis in the authority of the church in the Age of Enlightenment. This rudimentary state of demythologizing science relegates scientific descriptions and theories of self, world, and God alongside, rather than above, religious, artistic, and moral descriptions and theories of the self, world, and God. This process signifies a deep authority crisis in knowledge and a kind of demonopolizing of science on truth, reality, and reality in the marketplace of ideas. It raises the prospect of a plurality of epistemic authorities on truth and reality, as well as frightening full-blown relativism or laissez-faire policy regarding access to truth and reality. Now, I think because this feels so fresh and so relevant to our contemporary moment, is the subject of my first question today. So revisiting this 40 years later, Professor West, do you have anything to add here? So we live in a world plagued by the rapid spread of misinformation and disinformation, accelerated by algorithms honed to precision in the service of surveillance capitalism. We are dealing with vaccine skepticism that speaks both the language of the scientific method, that is, I just want to do my own research, and we really just don't have enough data yet, as well as the language of hippie, vegan, wellness. So all of this, I think, is fed by inequality and a sense of powerlessness. Even if among white middle class, upper middle class Americans, it is only the feeling of losing illegitimate cultural power. As well, I'm sensitive to the fact that the Lululemon yoga mom variant of vaccine hesitancy and skepticism and the turn toward the wellness industry in general, and companies like Cruz in particular, has been driven by doctors' dismissal of women's testimony regarding their experiences of pain, by testimonial injustice, or if you prefer, by epistemic oppression. In any case, I would like to know if you've had any comments about where we are now in this crisis and any ideas for how we might get out of it. Now, Professor West tells the story of the rise of white American self-confidence as things fall apart, their movement from self-conscious colonial provinciality, of being American but feeling European, of being provincial but yearning for British cosmopolitanism, which is kind of a funny thing to think about post-Brexit, but of being incompletely civilized and materially prosperous, such that Africans in America, with their own emerging two-ness, confronted a dominant white population in the midst of its full-on anxiety attack to these same provincial, and he describes a world in which eventually these same provincials begin to run things, and that is run things into the ground. And of course, he also documents the ever plucky and tragic Africans in America trying at turns to integrate into or radically transform a burning house. Now, part of my current research examines the place of lynching in the story of Black peoplehood and how W.B. Du Bois and others wrote lynching into the story of Black peoplehood through connecting lynching through narrative and imagery to the biblical crucifixion. What this means in practice is that I now perk up anytime I see the word theodicy. So I was very happy to see it here. And I truly appreciate Professor West's concise, clear, and convincing summary of the intellectual, existential, and the political reasons that Blacks chose Christianity. And it is a description to which I will return. So intellectually, they could see that Christianity is a religion for the oppressed. It is a theodicy, a story of the triumph of good over evil, and wow, have Blacks had some evil to overcome. Now you say the intellectual life of the African slaves in the U.S., like that of all oppressed people, consisted primarily in reckoning with the dominant form of evil in their lives. The Christian emphasis on against the evidence hope for triumph over evil struck deep among them. And I wonder if, given the declining significance of the church in the lives of some, so of course not all Blacks, you think that we have replaced this new struggle of good over evil, right? So not to belabor my former point, but have we replaced it, or has it been replaced with conspiracy theories, for example? Now, I was convinced by your existential argument, but I would not be a good political theorist and a good feminist political theorist at that if I did not press you on your political arguments in light of new scholarly work. But of course, I want to do so respectfully as a proudly Latin Baptist and the daughter and granddaughter of deacons and deaconesses. Now, you say that the primary political appeal of Methodists and Baptists was the open access to leadership roles and the loose requirements for leadership, and you pause to note, I think, you do well to pause to note the good and the bad here, right? So the good is the independent control of the church, which gives us all manner of things, which promoted the proliferation of African styles and manners within the Black Christian tradition. It produced community-minded political leaders and polished orators, as we know, activist journalists and scholars. And in fact, the unique variant of American life that we call Afro-American culture germinated in the bosom of this Afro-Christianity in the Afro-Christian church congregation. But the bad, as you know, is the charismatic or autocratic leadership of the church structure. Now, You begin the book by saying that Afro-American thought must take seriously the most influential and enduring intellectual tradition in its experience, that is evangelical and pietistic Christianity. African-American theological reflection encompasses both prophetic and priestly streams, and African-American critical thought must focus on the former of these, the prophetic. Now, you say that this has been guided by a profound conception of human nature and human history, a persuasive picture of what one is as a person and what one should hope for and how one ought to act. It also proposes two fundamental moral norms, you say, that of individuality and democracy as the center of Afro-American thought. So the prophetic Christian dialectic of human nature and human history produces democracy as its second fundamental norm. Democracy requires the accountability of institutions to the leaders, institutions to the populace, of leaders to followers, of preachers to laity, that be the center of any acceptable social vision. Now, you note that charismatic and autocratic organization of the church, despite the radical egalitarianism of prophetic Christianity. So my question is this: as we sit here today, after the critiques of Barbara Ramsey and Erica Edwards, how does the democratic norm of prophetic Christianity how much does this norm depend on the dialectic between the male-dominated prophetic traditions in the Black church and the woman-led tradition of missionary service? Because the first fundamental norm you outlined, that's a basic contribution of prophetic Christianity, is that every individual, regardless of class, country, caste, race, or sex, should have the opportunity to fulfill his or her potentiality, was, if it was ever realized in Black churches, only realized along gendered lines. So we know that Barbara Ramsey has described as a tension between the missionary traditions that she associates with Ella Baker and the more messianic or ministerial traditions she associates with King, and she recovers Baker to champion her as an exemplar of a non-hierarchical and radically democratic form of political struggle, and to criticize a form of politics she attributes to King. So what is democratic about a view like King, for example, that leadership never ascends from the pew to the pulpit, but descends from the pulpit to the pew, right? So you've also, I think, you've written eloquently about the prophetic witness of Ida B. Wells, Francis Beale, and Toni Morrison. But what about our tendency to mistake the prophet for our divine leader, and our tendency to only hear prophetic truth from those endowed with our profoundly gendered notions of charisma? So here, Erica Edwards says that the charismatic leadership ideal is an ideal that situates authority or the right to rule in one exceptional figure perceived to be gifted with a privileged connection to the divine. The charismatic leader is both gifted and a gift himself. He is given divine authority and power, given to the people, and given for the sake of historical change. Now, she says charisma participates in a gendered economy of political authority, in which the attributes of the leader are the traits American society usually conceives as rightly belonging to men and to normative masculinity, that is ambition, courage, and above all, divine calling. It is for this reason, she says, that Black female leaders have either been written out of history or masculinized or subject to violent gender policing. So the conflation of charisma and normative manliness, the desire to maintain charismatic authority as the primary marker of masculinity, most properly attached to the biological male body form, is, she says, an epistemological conceptual violation that has actual and physical effects. So I would ask finally, how do we deal with this as African-American critical theorists in order to get all that we can out of our tradition of Black Christianity? And how should we, as African-American critical theorists, confront this problem of charismatic authority in a world of diversified authority? Thank you.
It's an honor, as always, to follow my brilliant friend, Shatima Threadcraft. Thank you all for having me today. Thank you, Jonathan, for arranging this. Thank you, Sue, for getting us all here safely. And of course, thank you, Professor West, for your singular and singularly ambitious book, Prophesy Deliverance. When you read Prophesy Deliverance, the staggering breadth of its references, the uncanny insight of its best arguments, and the idiosyncrasy and creativity of its animating categories are as imposing as they are invigorating. I first read it when I was a college undergraduate and found myself drowning in a sea of things that I had no idea even existed before I opened this book. But it's an education, and it's something you learn with as you reread it. And it was a real joy to return to, because there are arguments in it that even that first time reading it struck me so powerfully that they've never strayed far from my mind. Who but Cornel could take, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois's influential concept of double consciousness and point out with arresting clarity that when Du Bois describes Black oppression as involving the measurement of one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, that Du Bois failed to note that this sense of diminishment was further refracted through America's broader sense of inferiority and derivativeness in the face of European cultural authority. Who but Cornel could have rediscovered and restated the central significance of metaphor and aesthetics to the invention of modern racism, filling out the weaknesses of materialist and psychological theories with the generative categories of aesthetic judgment. But reading Prophesy Deliverance as a political theorist and a historian of political thought, which I grew up to be, the chapter I've long been most preoccupied with is the chapter I was assigned, the 4 traditions of response. Now, it's difficult in this day and age to appreciate the sclerotic state of the interpretive debate on African-American political thought and cultural politics when Cornell's masterwork exploded on the scene. Within contemporary African-American studies, if you take your classes now, we're at least 2 generations into an explosion of interest in Black political thought and culture, and students find themselves awash in ever more granular descriptions of Black radical traditions and Black eco-criticisms, or allegations of Afro-pessimism and Black neoliberalism. But as Cornel remarks throughout Prophesy Deliverance, at the time of his composition of that book, both the study and practice of African-American political thought remained constrained by a severely limited view of the subject. Many occasional commentators on Black politics and culture, especially in the white academy, broadly accepted at that time the fundamentally racist and intellectually uninteresting view that if the Negro managed to produce something that qualified as thought, it would be essentially derivative. Thematically obsessed with protest, it would either repeat the terms of American liberalism and Protestantism back to a society that had fallen short, or react in psychological frustrations manifest as separatism and chauvinism. Others, developing a somewhat more sophisticated mapping of Black political culture, distilled the central fault line into a binary struggle between integrationism and nationalism. The most influential figure for cementing this dichotomy as a matter of intellectual life was the iconoclastic cultural critic Harold Cruz, whose 1967 classic, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, insisted on this binary opposition between integration and nationalism as the organizing motif of Black politics and culture from as early as the 1850s debate on immigration between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, or whether African Americans should leave the United States and try again elsewhere in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act. The problem with this interpretive frame, of course, was that it buried all manner of debates about capitalism, gender, and a vast array of other ethical and social matters under the all-determining question of integration. This image of Black political culture, it's important to note, was held in place not just through a quirk of the mind, but by deep structural constraints on African American organizing and expression. As far back as the great debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, as Cornel argues, progressive black political activity was severely constrained by lack of access to media and public debate, by exclusion from formal political participation, and a deep dependency on exogenous factors like patronage or crises of war and labor shortages to get any foothold. Given the constraints and ideological mystifications that structured the space of appearances where black politics could make itself manifest, it was easy even for thoughtful students of black politics to reduce its key preoccupations to what Cornel calls inclusion within the rapidly expanding American capitalist order. In doing so, however, these frameworks rendered illegible efforts by those like A. Philip Randolph, Cyril Briggs, Claudia Jones, Ella Baker, Martin Luther King Jr., and others to raise ethical and political critiques of the fundamental economic and militaristic practices of American civilization as the logical and moral precondition for categories like integration or self-determination to even make sense. Right? We lost that piece of the puzzle. What West achieves in Prophesy Deliverance is a recovery. In fact, it's more than a recovery. It's a frontal assault on this reductive binary, remapping the contours and content of black political culture with unprecedented originality. For West, the key questions are not integration or nationalism, but self-image and self-determination. How do we conceive of ourselves and the groups to which we belong? And how do we imagine contributing equally to deliberation and decision-making about a life lived in cooperation with others? Taking the organizing thematics of black political culture to this sparer, more fundamental level allows West to reconfigure the terrain and offer the four traditions of response. The first is an exceptionalist tradition, evidenced by black nationalists and those like the early Du Bois, who so fetishize the uniqueness of African American culture and personality that they often end up in claims that romanticize black cultural particularity and racial solidarity in service of the economic interests of a striving black bourgeoisie. Then there's the assimilationist tradition, which West identifies with my fellow Baltimorean E. Franklin Frazier, and today appears in someone like John McWhorter, which so emphasizes African American cultural and political pathology, or sees it everywhere, and sees it as an obstacle to assimilation to American middle-class norms. This tradition exhorts African Americans to self-help and cultural reformation, but often ends up ignoring social structural analysis, further stigmatizing the most disadvantaged African Americans and failing to see the critical and normative insights of practices that we currently refer to as deviant and degraded. The marginalist tradition is the third one that West identifies. That's exemplified by the great writers of the tradition, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. It diagnoses African American culture as unduly constraining on individuality and nonconformity. But politics here don't have a clear-cut collective dimension. They manifest themselves primarily as moralistic criticism and individualist revolt, lingering in a sense of critical alienation from others that's dispiriting to the broader group. And finally, West defends what he calls the fourth tradition, which is the humanist tradition. And its exemplars are folks like Ralph Ellison or the late Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. This tradition treats black expressive culture as a profound archive of struggle and creativity concerning the universal value of freedom, and trying to promote radical conceptions of individuality and democracy from within. And I think Professor West's lecture last night gives you a good sense of what he thinks the humanist tradition is aiming to do. Now, I want you to know it's difficult to overstate just how idiosyncratic this new mapping of black political culture is. West emphasizes, for example, the connection between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, who most people treat as polar opposites and emphasize how much they hated each other, right? He puts Toni Morrison and Richard Wright together when many who teach this material want to again situate them at opposite ends of the most important thematic questions in the tradition. West's goal is to scramble the easy categories and tired oppositions we've inherited to think about black art and politics. And what makes this possible for him, I think, are two moves. The first is that, as Shatima laid out, he stridently argues that the postmodern era, which you can describe as an era of formal legal inclusion against the backdrop of broader, deep crises of post-industrial capitalism, collapsing European and American empire, and the collapse of traditional epistemic authority. These phenomena have ushered in a new age of black politics as well. What we're seeing in black communities post-Jim Crow and in this postmodern era is fragmentation across gender, geography, class, and ideological lines, and changes in the economic and global structures of power. And these changes, as he argues prophetically, have rendered the old Du Bois-Washington debate obsolete. The obvious inability of this older inheritance to speak to the present problem space allows West to rethink the black tradition anew, as if for the first time. This reconfiguration and collision of ideas, in turn, helps make more plausible the synthesis between Marxism, pragmatism, and Christianity he offers at the end of the book. The second move that makes this powerful and possible, and is even perhaps more intriguing, is that West explicitly moves from talk of political ideologies, which is usually how we would do it in political science, to talk of traditions of cultural response. And it follows for him, this category follows for him from his premise that culture is more fundamental to the ethics of the oppressed than politics, narrowly construed. There are questions posed consistently by black intellectuals and artists about what is to be done, existentially, ethically, practically, whose grammars do not fit neatly in the vocabularies developed by mainstream academic political philosophy. These quandaries, above all, involve questions of cultural philosophy. What practices do you have at your disposal which are truly purposive, meaningful, or life-affirming in response to the scale and substance of the challenges and crises you confront in your shared forms of life? To the extent that political philosophy remains fixated narrowly on questions of statecraft or political legitimacy, it just will simply miss this entire realm of African American political and cultural life, which must confront these questions of meaning and doing first. Indeed, West admits to his typology being influenced by the study of Jewish, Spanish, and women intellectuals in other situations of oppression. And his achievement suggests not only a critique of the reigning paradigms of black political thought, but perhaps just as importantly, a template for the comparative study globally of the ethics of the oppressed. Despite the vast interest in that comparative study by students all around the globe, actual progress in this domain remains stunted by romantic repetition of the old tropes of third world discourse and the revival of what I take to be a radically exceptionalist mood in African American studies and black critical theory. I think a generative, subtle move that West makes is to implicitly draw a distinction between humanist philosophy conducted in a self-absorptive mood, trying to understand your own cultural resources, and a full-blown exceptionalism that precludes a real exchange of resources across cultural boundaries. This subtle argument is really powerful, and I think is an important rejoinder to scholars of African American studies who would silo the field and make it impossible to engage in dialogue with others. I want to end then by asking 5 questions for discussion, which I think flow naturally out of rereading the essay for its 40th anniversary. The first and most obvious is, what has happened since? How do West categories, these 4 traditions of response, meet traditions that have emerged in recent years and that claim a novelty for themselves? Afro-pessimism, the Obama phenomenon, neoliberalism? Is there anything genuinely new that can emerge, or are we still operating within the categories that he's given us back in 1982? The second question is a Nietzschean one. How much of what West identifies as traditions of response are actually parasitic on deeper psychological types and dispositions that we have as individuals? And this is the kind of argument that Nietzsche advances in The Genealogy of Morality, and that Richard Wright, Nietzsche's unheralded Afro-American heir, lays out in White Man Listens' most polemical essay on the psychological reactions of oppressed peoples. Right? Are there psychological types that underlie West's diagnosis, requiring another layer of inquiry above the cultural hermeneutic layer? The third question, which anchors what you might call Cornel West studies, which I think is what we're engaged in here today, is what changes in his evaluation of exemplary figures over time. So in Prophesy Deliverance, Morrison is located as an exemplar of the Marginalist tradition. But over the course of Cornel's work, Morrison seems to have grown in esteem as a grand exemplar of the humanist tradition. Why? What has changed about his reading of Morrison's work that's caused these categories to move and to scramble? The last is a normative and analytical one. How does West's defense of Marxist-inflected, Christian-inspired humanism meet the novel challenges of the anti-humanist turn in Black studies? How do we continue to insist on human agency and humanistic ethics, whether inspired by Christianity, Marxism, or pragmatism, in a world where we seem overdetermined by ecological, epidemiological, and technological dynamics far beyond our rational control or our moral frameworks? Or to speak within West categories, why humanism after all this time? What about the marginalist tradition? What about imagining the marginalist tradition in a more dialectical or maybe even prophetic fashion? And standing so at odds with the groups we know, or even our conception of the human as currently constituted, isn't the marginalist a key figure for us, who provocatively reflects in discourse and art an image of ourselves that we can come to find shameful and unattractive? And yet, insofar as we recognize some dimension of ourselves in it, marginalist thought and writing can produce dissonance and decentering, maybe even revolutionary shame that makes possible the kinds of deep transformations of self-image and self-determination that West calls for so powerfully as part of his revolutionary project. Thanks.
First of all, good morning, everyone. I said I'm the old scholar on the panel. I bring paper. It's indeed an honor to be here today. I have Professor West, I have my students from Introduction to African American Studies here. And in many ways, now I learn from them each and every Tuesday and Thursday. And now they see the professor who stands up in the classroom in front of his professor. And then trying to capture some words to make sense of that fourth chapter, that encounter between Black theology and Marxism. I'm always amazed at what should I say. Now, there are two things about this particular chapter and my response to it that frame it. First, I want to thank my colleagues here at Wake Forest. I call ourselves the Fourth Afternoon Collective. During the month of October, we met October 14th and October 28th, to go through and discuss this text. And in the process of going through this text, about 20 of us, faculty from across the university, along with colleagues from out in the Winston-Salem community, we found so many avenues of entry, points of entry, and the text came alive in new ways for me. And I want to thank them for helping me clarify my thinking. Now, all the mistakes are mine. I told them I was going to blame them, but I want to thank them for helping me think through this text. And it is this text that is an event in the creation of community. And it created a new community here at Wake Forest in October. This text also reminds me of my service when we, as honorary co-chair and as on the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, before now, when it's so big. But then it was intimate conversations with you, with Joe Schwartz, and the history of DSA, and trying to figure out which path forward, particularly with young people, that we were trying to figure out how should we begin to take a humanist turn in Marxism in the 21st century. So those two anchors, the Fourth Afternoon Collective and our shared service with DSA, grounds these reflections. And it's a statement that you made in the text that I use as the epigraph. The primary aim of this encounter is to change the world, not each other's faith. It is no secret that the question of liberation raised a series of provocative encounters in the wake of the modern Black freedom movement. We need look no further than on the pages of the Black Scholar in 1975, where William Strickland raised the important question, what happened to the politics of liberation? Strickland's question was grounded in a critical analysis of the fracture and waning of a Black freedom movement that had galvanized an African American community to move toward a fundamental revaluation of American democracy. It was also a question that was not of mere academic or parochial interest. It went to the very heart of the political malaise that had captured the revolutionary intent of a Black politics and a Black political imagination that was arrested in its development. In its wake, a series of political philosophies, from the varieties of Black nationalisms, Pan-Africanisms, Black feminisms, to a virulent Marxist sectarianism, captured the original and creative thrust of an emerging new Black freedom politics. Concomitantly, the Keynesian consensus that had spurred the post-World War II growth in America had come to an end, and deindustrialization, coupled with a virulent and violent neoliberal political regime announced by Richard Nixon, colonized the American political landscape. It is in this context and its long wake that a critical intellectual confrontation between Marxism and a renewed criticism, not secular in its genealogy, but inclusive of a deep religious strain, was staged. The aim of Prophesy Deliverance, as an attempt to put forward an Afro-American philosophy that is essentially a specific expression of contemporary American philosophy, which takes seriously the Afro-American experience, would by necessity confront one of the efforts that sought to challenge the prevailing intellectual and political regime of American life and culture. That effort was Black theology. The 1969 publication of James H. Cone's Black Theology and Black Power marked a pivotal moment in theological and political discourse. Black theology and black power extended a spirit of an approach, an intransigent, and even incorruptible ethos of writing and thinking without concession to theology, not letting public opinion, the media, or the phantasm of an intimidating readership force one into a simplifying and repressing position in articulating its revolutionary message. The book aimed to theologically express what Lerone Bennett termed in 1964 as the cataclysmic shift in the mood of Negroes. However, the book entered a dominant social and intellectual context whereby it could only be misread. Theologians did not know what to make of a phenomenon that staked ultimate claims on the material conditions of African Americans. Scholars did not understand the poaching of the language of black power within an overdetermined theological discourse. The foundational misreading was facilitated by the existence of conditions of possibility of blackness as humanity existing only within the limits of whiteness alone. Hence, Cone's text was a violation. Moreover, by wedding theology and black power, thus making explicit the always already conflict of sovereignties that lie at the heart of the project of the modern nation state, mainly theology and politics. The text instantiated a political violation and in the conceptual universe of democracy proper. Black theology and black power simply could not be read. The only way to comprehend it was by a legitimate and legitimating misreading by way of another text that preceded it, the hate that hate produced. In 1959, the 1959 2.5-hour documentary produced by Mike Wallace and Louis Lomax provided the categories and frameworks that aligned a general economy of white supremacy with black theology and black power. That is, a specific class produced within an ontology of whiteness served as the governing category of intelligibility of all instantiations of power. A misreading of black theology and black power was only possible because of the governing consensus and the reigning ideological regime. Thus, the question posed by theologian Paul Lehman to James Cone on the occasion of his interview for a first appointment at Union Theological Seminary, why in the hell did you write that book? Black theology and black power was part of a flowering of theological works in a period of intense critical reflection on the philosophies and practices of black power. Indeed, in the year prior to the publication of Cone's text, the appearance of Albert Clegg's theologically revolutionary collection of sermons, The Black Messiah, issued forth. C. Eric Lincoln's theological update of Rayford Logan's 1944 collection of social criticism, What the Negro Wants, in his book, Is Anybody Listening to Black America, was published. And James Cone published his first essay, Christianity and Black Power, as the lead in the collection of texts edited by C. Eric Lincoln. The emergence of black power in the midst of the black freedom movement destabilized the liberal consensus regarding American race relations and converged with a new spirit of freedom as well as new movements challenging the prevailing post-war order. For Cone, Black theology and Black power would be a unique product of the civil rights and Black power movements in America. It reflected both their strengths and their weaknesses. Calling into question America's theopolitical project forced the emergence of new alternatives to Christianity and democracy, Black theology and Black power. Yet, Black theology's determined gaze on the epistemic imperialism of white theology and white power left unassailed the challenges presented by rapacious capitalism and the arbitrary and absolute proclivities of an insidious American imperialism that laid waste to peoples and cultures across the world. In many ways, Black theology failed to fully confront the deep and probing critique of Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for a transformation of values. King's call for this transformation was not merely rhetorical wordplay to rearrange American capitalist imperium. Rather, it was a fundamental critique of the existing order of things. In commenting on King's last protest with the Memphis sanitation workers, Brandon Terry reminds us of the biting critique of King. King sought to link our inability, Terry writes, to recognize the dignity of such work and the people who performed it to forms of reification and ideology that we inherited from a sordid history of coerced labor and economic exploitation. In his last presidential address to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, King insisted that a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore, they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. Our attributions of value, or the ways we treat our fellows more like objects, things, or commodities than equal persons, are embedded in and overdetermined by social structures that constantly impose such relations as natural, inevitable, or rational. The force of such a critique would issue forth from the realm, not from the realm of the theological, but rather philosophy, an Afro-American philosophy that would be pressed into service toward this end. In his lead essay of 1977, in the double issue of the Philosophical Forum, edited by Jesse McDade on the theme Philosophy and the Black Experience, Cornel West posits a definition of Afro-American philosophy that is acutely instructive for understanding the critical encounter he stages between Marxism and Black theology. Afro-American philosophy is the interpretation of Afro-American history, highlighting the cultural heritage and political struggles which provide desirable norms that should regulate responses to particular challenges presently confronting Afro-Americans. In this formulation, history, or rather historical phenomena, offers us the ideas, norms, and perspectives in order for us to critically engage in the interpretation, adjudication, affirmation, and justification of ideas, norms, and perspectives in response to existential and political dilemmas currently besetting a cultural way of life. West develops and deploys a Gramscian philosophy of history and culture in developing a practice of cultural criticism that is not aimed at ending philosophy proper, but rather serving as a critical resource in creating a more just, humane, and most importantly, democratic existence. To think West's 1977 article, to think West's 1977 article, particularly as it forms and informs the critical basis of Prophesy Deliverance, is to also confront the work of an earlier philosopher who stages a critical confrontation between Marxism and the black experience. Despite the efforts of John McClendon to baptize him as a scientific Marxist or Marxist-Leninist, Howard philosopher Eugene Holmes engages the broad currents of Marxist thought and African-American culture in advancing a philosophical vision that seeks to respond to the revolutionary dynamics afloat in the world and the precarity that defines African-American existence in the United States. For Holmes and for West, humanist and ethical commitments demand pressing philosophy to respond to the very problems of life and society. Holmes turns to Marx, particularly the early Marx engaging Feuerbach and Proudhon, a humanist Marx, guides Holmes into the rich terrain of culture and his ongoing engagement with the philosophical midwife of the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke. Culture becomes the terrain to unpack the deep meanings of the life worlds, self-understandings, and self-representations of African Americans. A year after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Holmes would write, Humanist and ethical considerations and philosophical analysis must be paid attention to whenever we try to engage minority group problems. Prophesy Deliverance can be thought as forming the third in a trinity of texts that stages a critical encounter between Marxist thought and Afro-American experience. Manning Marable's 1981 Blackwater, Historical Studies in Race, Class Consciousness, and Revolution, opens with a series of essays that engage radical black thinking and revolutionary black religion in the service of liberation. From Nat Turner to black African-American religious spirituals, to the religious dimensions of black radical thought, Blackwater engages in a dialectical investigation between Marxism and black history. Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class plumbs the depth of black women's experience in the black freedom struggle and the women's liberation movement in recovering those marginalized voices, perspectives, and ideas of black women in an attempt to transform a racist, sexist, and classist capitalist political economy. Davis does not shy away from deploying a critical Marxist hermeneutic in uncovering the class dimensions of black women's oppression in these liberatory movements, as well as recovering the critical traditions of black women to open up the terrain of freedom. Marable and Davis tilled the ground that Cornel West would come in and reap the harvest. They remind us that there's a critical opportunity presented by Marxist thought in plumbing the depths of the black experience. For West, Marxism is not a science, nor should it be approached dogmatically. Rather, Marxism, inspired by the Western Marxist tradition of Lukács and Gramsci, focuses our attention critically on the question of culture that is distinctive and central to modern life in general, and African American life in particular. Indeed, culture and politics are inseparable and must be thought together through a sophisticated methodology that does not reduce one to the other. This tradition also enables us to think the multiple oppressions facing African Americans and informing African American experience. As West recounts in the chapter, the encounter between Marxism and black theology facilitates a more critical probing of the contours of black experience under hegemonic white supremacy, misogynist male sexism, and an exploitive neoliberal capitalism. Marxist thought also facilitates a critical recognition that a change in the order of things is not only possible, but indeed fundamental to realizing a new humanity and a new world. West stages the encounter between Black theology and Marxism not in order to transform reality and initiate a radical, deep democracy. Theology is barbaric. Marxism is debased. Prophesy Deliverance is a critical response in form and in content in attempting to write and think and enact a new world in this way. By bringing together prophetic modes of Afro-Christian thought and progressive Marxism with its exemplary articulation in the praxis of the Reverend George Washington Woodbey, West demonstrates the analytical power and praxis for life and thought. It is the project of Afro-American revolutionary Christianity that may offer a new spirit of hope in struggle and a new possibility of deep democracy that gestures toward a new world and a new humanity. Perhaps this is the only philosophy possible, then and now. Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank once again the organizers for bringing us together. Thank you all for joining us on a Friday morning. And thank you, Brother West, for simply just being you. I was at dinner last night, and one of my table mates, George, asked me the question, so what is your connection to Cornel West? And I began to tell him that I took a few classes from him when I was a fellow at Harvard University, took a W. Du Bois class with him, took a James Baldwin and Hansberry class with him. But then I began to tell George that when I was a freshman at Morgan State University, I was trying to figure out what I was going to major in, and originally I was a communications major, but then by my second semester I decided I wanted to change my major to philosophy. And I did that because I just felt that I wanted to engage in philosophical thinking for the rest of my life. And it wasn't because I took a philosophy course. I had not taken a philosophy course after I changed my major, but because I knew there was a person that existed in the world who looked like me and who served as a model that even as a Black person, I can engage in philosophical thought, and that was Brother West. So thank you so much for being a model of integrity, intellectual excellence, intellectual humility. I am here because of you, and I'm just hoping that all of us can live up. I mean, we can't live up to what you did in this book because you were 28 years old and we are old and still haven't achieved this, but I began to show George a picture that we had taken 22 years ago at Morgan State University. And then George began to tell me that I still look the same. And then I started to blush and feel good about myself, went back to the hotel and slept like a baby. In 2010, Eddie Glaude proclaimed in a Huffington Post article that the Black church as we have known it is dead. For Glaude, the ideal of this venerable institution as central to Black life and as a repository for the social and moral conscience of the nation has all but disappeared. He then asked, what will be the role of prophetic Black churches? He believes that its apt role has been obscured and interrupted by distracting, quote, invitations to financial empowerment conferences and other gatherings, in contrast to mobilization in public around pressing issues of our day, end quote. Recognizing this lack of the prophetic, he asks, where are the press conferences and impassioned efforts around Black children living in poverty, and commercials and organizing around jobs and healthcare reform? While he believes that prophetic energies can't be passed down but can be embraced and expressed again, one must wonder if the Black church has given up its prophetic energy in exchange for profitable energy. This worry is not just unfounded anxiety. It can be backed up by empirical studies of Black American life. In their article, The Faith of Black Politics, McDaniel et al. Writes, just as Black politics has witnessed a declining commitment to racial and class equality, the Black church's message of social and spiritual salvation is losing its prominence to a theology that emphasizes individual faith and material accumulation. They found that religious beliefs are associated with difference in group identity and support of strategies to achieve racial equality. For example, researchers have linked the prosperity gospel to the rise of racial conservatism among Blacks and neoliberalism among Black elites. According to the prosperity gospel, people with faith will be rewarded with wealth and health in this world and the world to come. Christians with faith will be divinely favored with material possessions, while those who lack it will be punished. Researchers have found that Blacks are significantly more supportive of the prosperity gospel than whites, and as a result, this influences how they view the underlying causes of poverty and its solutions. And this has led some adherents to believe that racism and classism is a product of poor faith, as opposed to social structures, that poverty is the cause of sinful behavior, and that inequality can be prayed away. In many ways, we can describe Glaude's concern and the empiricist assessment as an Afro-American Christianity lacking in revolutionary and prophetic power. Similarly, recent celebration by the Black masses in regards to a select few reaching billionaire status as if it will equate to Black liberation is telling of our culture's obsession with capitalism and neoliberalism. In the last 2 years, Forbes magazine has reported that musician Rihanna is worth $1.7 billion, only second to Oprah as the richest female entertainer, and that Tyler Perry is worth $1 billion due to his creative projects in film, television, and the stage. When Forbes failed to report the rapper Kanye West had reached the 1 billion mark, he accused him of trying to suppress his self-made narrative because of his race. In response, he provided receipts and was eventually declared a billionaire. But then Kanye noted, it's not a billion, it's 3.3 billion, since no one at Forbes knows how to count. Black cultural rhetoric seems to embody Perry's misguided words expressed in an interview with Forbes that, quote, ownership changes everything, as phrases such as get the bag and we might be Black billionaires in the making become not just part of Black vernacular speech, but a large part of Black aspirations for many. In many ways, we can describe the nature of African Americans' cultural obsession with this brand of financial achievement as lacking in progressive Marxism. This combination of loss of prophetic energy, the ignoring and obscuring the root causes of suffering, and obsessions with wealth as freedom makes Prophesy Deliverance not only still relevant, but necessary for our times. As the prosperity gospel infiltrates Black churches and neoliberalism seduces Black culture, still Black people are being killed, the poor are being oppressed, trans folks are being attacked, those in developing countries are being exploited, and the marginalized are being ignored. A different, more revolutionary vision and strategy for liberation is needed. Even 40 years after its publication, Cornel West provides an essential intervention. The task of Afro-American religious philosophy, he writes, is to provide a political prescription for or strategic intervention into the specific praxis in the present historical moment of the struggle for liberation. The prescription he offers, which is a way of thinking and acting, is Afro-American revolutionary Christianity. And in chapter 5 of the text, he highlights the practical and pragmatic dimensions of this revolutionary Christian perspective and practice. So what is it? It's a combination of prophetic Christianity and progressive Marxism that is lacking in the aforementioned examples. West notes that prophetic Christianity is concerned with existential freedom and social freedom. It's guided by profound conception of human nature and human history, a persuasive picture of what one is as a person, what one should hope for, and how one ought to act. This prophetic features imbues Afro-American thinking with the sobriety of tragedy, the struggle for freedom, and the spirit of hope. But he also calls us to negate what is and transform prevailing realities against the backdrop of the present historical limits. Progressive Marxism is anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. It offers powerful critiques via the dialectic method and engages in praxis. It is neither dogmatic nor elitist. It rejects bourgeoisie electoral activity. It is the opposite of political liberalism. Liberalism affirms the capitalistic vision of society, focuses on political and economic integration into mainstream of American life. This, in turn, for West, creates a viewpoint that clamors for a bigger piece of the ever-growing American pie. Both prophetic Christianity and progressive Marxism are guided by, committed to, embodies, and encourages the norms of individuality and democracy. This brand of individuality is not the kind that promotes a selfish, anti-community, self-made perspective. Rather, for West, it is one that is concerned with our salvation, as well as our dignity as persons, and our agential capacities to transform the world in which we live. It, quote, reinforces the importance of community, the common good, and the harmonious development of personality, end quote. This commitment to democracy is one that is concerned with the people having control over the leaders and institutions that serve them. Therefore, it's a democracy that requires that accountability of institutions to populace, of leaders to followers, of preachers to laity to be the center of any acceptable social vision. This Afro-American revolutionary Christianity, with this combination of prophetic Christianity and progressive Marxism, dedicated to the norms of individuality and democracy, is needed. As West writes, for Americans, especially African Americans, adopting a particular Marxist perspective and praxis is an act of desperation, yet we live in desperate times. And since the absence of it has not created a better world, it's understandable that it proceeds from persistent pessimism regarding the American way of life, yet such pessimism is, for the most part, warranted. But there are advantages in adopting this prescription. West notes that this Afro-American revolutionary Christianity can weaken the hegemony of liberalism over the Afro-American community. This hegemony has led the African-American community to really ask fundamental questions about why the American pie is never sliced equally or how it's baked. It has thus contributed to many remaining silent about class divisions and how unequal distributions of goods undergird discrimination against regions, impose ceilings on upward social mobility, and foster racism, sexism, and ageism. Thus, adopting it will allow us to understand in order to enhance and enrich the lives of Afro-Americans. What results, according to West, is that we become closer to figuring out the fundamental determinant of Black oppression and create effective strategies to alleviate it. It will help us to refrain from equating liberation with inclusion and American middle-class status and a well-paying job with power. It would allow us to address unequal distribution and work to ensure that oppressive capitalist systems does not stay intact. Without focusing on this prophetic progressive relationship, Cornel West reminds us that it becomes extremely difficult to present an idea of liberation with social economic content. Thus, the progressive merging with the prophetic allows for, quote, an emergence of a substantive political program or social vision informed by a clear-cut social theory in addition to the moral norms thus described. In conclusion, while I think that that there are less signs of hope for the institutional expression of revolutionary Christian perspective and practice today than West lays out at the end of chapter 5. I believe that it is still needed, but some questions remain. Should we give up this institutional hope, given the consistent failure of Black church leadership and the mass exodus of Black people from Black churches? If so, where should this hope lie? Will individual expression alone weaken the power and reach of Black revolutionary Christianity? What is the hope for African Americans who have left the Christian church or the Christian faith, although it has not left them, disillusioned by the lack of the prophetic and progressive found there? Have they, by definition, lost access to this perspective and praxis too? And lastly, how Christian should Black revolutionary Christianity be? That is to say, is traditional Christianity sufficient revolutionary perspective and praxis? Or might a mixture of Eastern and African religious traditions add to, rather than subtract from, its revolutionary nature? Thank you.
I'm telling you, 40 years later, my soul looks back and wonders how I got over it. It's by a genius named Clara Ward, written in Atlanta in 1951 after the Klan had attacked their Cadillac with their mother Gertrude and sister. Wrote that song. And when I look back on this text, 40 years later, my brother Jonathan told me he wanted to get together. I said, "Are you sure, brother? Oh, good God Almighty." He said, "Yes, indeed. And I want to thank you, my brother. You're just not one of the great visionary and courageous leaders in American higher education, and the Grand Dean of Wake Forest and Divinity School, but you are my brother forever. Forever, my brother. I'll take a bullet for you." And to have the young voices, and I'll say a quick word about the voices, to have the young voices of such qualities, like, good God Almighty. See, this text was actually written under the shadow of death. It was dedicated to my grandfather, Reverend C.L. West, the chocolate side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Gap Band. I was born in the same hospital as the Wilson brothers. Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. That's what, you all know that. That's Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My Metropolitan Baptist Church, my grandfather had just died. And I had premonitions that I wouldn't be alive that long. And so when I was in conversation with Jim Washington, who's the best friend I ever had in the whole world, he's a towering figure. And I told him, I said, I am who I am because somebody loved me. This is going to be a love letter to the younger generation to give them a sense of how to map out the present so they could attempt to be a force for freedom and a force for good. So this text was not written by a spectator. It was written by a participant. It was written by somebody who was highly aware of the love and sacrifice that has gone into the shaping of the cracked vessel that I am. Irene and Clifton West, Shiloh Baptist Church, Reverend Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, and the Black Panther Party right next door on the chocolate side of Sacramento with Huey Newton, whose father, Reverend Newton, was pastor of Bethel Baptist Church in Monroe, Louisiana. And so you read in the first paragraph, I said, these constellation of sentences and configuration of paragraphs are put forward in order to constitute a material force for freedom. It's an echo of what Ralph Waldo Emerson said in his famous essay on Montaigne. Cut these sentences and they bleed. Touch these paragraphs and you feel wounds and bruises and scars of a great people. That's what gone into me. A great black people who in the face of overwhelming hatred still dishing out love. Teaching the world so much about what love is and what it can do. In the face of overwhelming trauma, still choosing to be wounded healers rather than wounded haters. That's a great spiritual achievement. It's not a function of skin pigmentation. It's a function of spiritual formation. It's a function of ethical cultivation. It's a function of divine connection and courageous action. So the voices that we've heard here are of the younger generation. I'm passing it on. Just like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, pass on the baton to the younger generation. Take it to the next level. Sly Stone said, I want to take you higher. Yes, Sly, that's what we saw this morning. These young folk took it higher. They took it higher. It's 40 years later. That's a beautiful thing. It's a magnificent thing. Because what I was trying to do in this text is to do what the musicians do, which is a revolutionary notion of just assume that black people are human. Ain't got to prove their humanity to nobody. Don't have to go through the perpetual audition of convincing the white mainstream that somehow they just good enough, they intelligent enough, they beautiful enough. No, they always already are human. That's what you get in John Coltrane coming out of this section of the country. Blowing his horn. Yes, it's a European instrument, but it's his humanity. He's not trying to prove nothing to anybody on the vanilla side of town. So it is with Manuel Scott when he steps up to the pulpit in Dallas. He's not trying to prove his humanity. He's expressing what God gave him in terms of his fundamental sense of being a human being. So I said, let me try to do the same thing that the musicians are doing in philosophy. They allow me to get to Harvard, ruling class site, Harvard, arrogant, Harvard, condescending, Harvard, wonderful folk too. That's true for all of us. That's true for Wake Forest. You all know who Reynolds was. First black brother from Kenya, make it through the white supremacist Wake Forest. Decent folk at Wake Forest. We talked about Mac Bryan last night. Towering white brother, love that brother. Don't even know him. Love the spirit. I try to love everybody, actually, so that's my Christian sensibility. But my point is this, that I said, what does the Western philosophical tradition, what does the American culture look like fundamentally through the lens of the doing and sufferings of black people? If I look at the great Socratic legacy of Athens, I read line 38a, Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living, the unexamined life is not a life of the human. And you know our English word human comes from the Latin humando, which means burial. That we're on the way to burial. We're vanishing organisms. We're disappearing creatures. Humanity, humility, tied to the earth and the dust. And what do we see in Socrates? Unbelievable intellectual integrity and courage. What do we see in Socrates at line 24a of Plato's Apology? The cause of my unpopularity was parrhesia, fearless speech, frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech. I love that about Socrates. But from the black side of town, Socrates never sheds a tear. Anybody who's never cried has never loved anybody. I can't conceive of myself without tears. Without tears flowing. Socrates, you need to be Socratized. In the name of many, in the name of black people. How can I raise my voice and lift my voice like the anthem of black people? Not flowing with tears, giving all of the suffering and misery and giving all of the joy, because sometimes they're tears of joy too. And I come to the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, where the evangelical pietistic tradition, and by piety, I don't mean uncritical deference to dogma, I don't mean blind obedience to doctrine, I mean acknowledging the sources of good in our lives, being able to acknowledge the debt that has been paid for us. As Toni Morrison put it, the crown that's already there, just put it on. Put it on. Grandmama already honed it out. Grandfather honed it out. Put on the crown, but you can't put on that crown without bearing your cross. Come on. Oh, that's my tradition. That's a great black tradition. It's in conversation with a whole host of other traditions from all around the world, but it comes out of gut bucket, enslaved, Jim Crow, Jane Crow USA.
Yes, sir.
And all of the black genius and black talent coming out of it. Looking at it, and I have an unflinching analysis of it. So European Enlightenment, rich, authority of science, yes, but that authority of science itself shot through with white supremacy, authorizing hierarchical rankings of different peoples based on skin color, justifying indigenous treatment, the treatment of indigenous peoples, justifying capitalist exploitation, justifying patriarchal domination of women. Enlightenment, how enlightened is the Enlightenment? That's the question from the black side of town, which is not the rejection of European Enlightenment. It's got some insights. But it's just putting that in context because we all crack vessels. U.S. experience. Magnificent words on paper. U.S. Constitution. Pro-slavery document in practice up until the Civil War. How do we come to terms with that? The greed, the hatred. How do we come to terms with the hypocrisy? And hypocrisy is the tribute that vice plays to virtue. So it's better to have hypocrites running around than just gangsters. Because gangsters have no standards whatsoever. That's part of our present moment today, the gangsterization of the country. Gangsters say anything and get away with it. Do anything and get away with it. Don't care about what virtue is. Don't care about what standards are. That's something different. Thomas Jefferson was a hypocrite who engaged in gangster treatment of black people. Brother Trump is a thoroughgoing gangster. He don't care. No, he lying. He don't care. Thrasymachus over Socrates in Plato's Republic. Might makes right. Power determines morality. Get over by any means.
Come on.
Oh, that's a very, very low point, nadir in the history of the American empire that we're living in today. 40 years ago, I was saying, let's keep track of all of these rich traditions, these various voices and figures and streams and strands within the tradition, not just of America, but of the world. The African backdrop of all of the very rich conceptions of I am because we are. Of Sankofa, you don't move forward unless you're in contact with the best of the past. The landmarks of the past that set the standards. That's why when I go to a studio all the time, I tell the young folk, do you all know you come from a tradition of originals? How come you're always obsessed with being copies? Evangelist was original. Donny Hathaway, original. Delphonics, original. I can go on and on. But now if it's just about cash, it's about music. It's about cream, as Wu-Tang said. Cash rules everything around me. Doesn't have to rule me. That's Wu-Tang. That's me. What we have here in this text is this simple attempt to think this young brother, cracked vessel, will write one book to the world, so he hopes maybe that a younger generation will have enough footnotes to be able to keep track of what is going on and will constitute a kind of education, a kind of paideia, a kind of formation of their attention, a kind of cultivation of critical consciousness, a kind of maturation of their loving souls, so they will know that they come from a great people. And by greatness, it has nothing to do with Alexander or Napoleon or Genghis Khan. Somewhere I read, he or she is greatest among you will be your servant, will be the quality of your love, the courage that you have to take a risk. They say, well, Brother West, we notice you get in a lot of trouble even with black folk. I said, then I must be true to my calling. If you don't love anybody, and you especially don't love black folk who have been taught to hate themselves, in order for them to love you back, you love black people because they're worthy of being loved. You bear your witness in light of the love that has been injected in you. And by love here, I'm not just talking about persons. I'm talking about love of truth. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. The love of beauty, always tied to wrestling with terror and trauma. The love of goodness, keeping track of the evil. And for me, as a Jesus-loving, free black man, it's the love of the holy. The way Marvin Gaye and Aretha Franklin sang about holy, holy. James Heaney was my editor who was so magnificent in Westminster. So the issue that Sister Shatima raised, charisma, relativism, crisis of science. That charisma is a dangerous thing, but we know it cuts across gender and sexual orientation, because I know some highly courageous sisters who have the same proclivities if they're not rendered accountable. Ella Baker understood that, so I'm not sure about just the gendered character of it. Ooh, no. Nina Simone sit down on the piano and all that charisma that she already got me. She ain't even played a note yet. But at the same time, it's got to be democratized, and I think that's where Sister Fatima and Ella and the others are absolutely right. It's absolutely right. But there's no way that we can escape charisma. It's here to stay. The question is democratizing it such that it has accountability, answerability, and so forth, you see. And we'll get a chance to talk more about that. In terms of the crisis of science and the so-called post-truth era and the proliferation of lies, we've always lived in cultures that are full of lies and crimes and mendacity and criminality and so forth. It's just more easily accessible these days given the technology that's in place. But we are a species that have deep proclivities toward believing in the efficacy of lies. That's just who we are. And we fear the truth. That's just who we are. But it can take various forms. It can be about religion, it can be about race, it can be about class, it can be about empire, it can be about a whole host of different things. Now when we talk about the humanist tradition, you know the line that I said in the humanist tradition, I said that the humanists par excellence are the musicians. And I didn't get a chance in that book. That book was almost twice as long, but we had to cut it. So I had a whole lot of good stuff. Oh, and I Brother Jake said, yeah, we can't have all this, Brother West. I said, oh, I got to finish, man. I got to say everything I got to say before I go. So I like being able to Westminster maybe get those manuscripts. It'd be fascinating to see what I said 40 years ago that we couldn't get in, you know what I mean? Because when I talk about the black musicians as the humanist par excellence, it was very much about trying to keep in contact with the best of the other three traditions. One of the reasons why Sister Tony's in there, because I was talking primarily about the Bluest Eye and Zula. And that was so early, her career was just beginning to take off. And by the time you get 5 years later to Beloved, greatest novel written in the last 75 years in American culture. That's a whole different thing. And her Catholicism, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. Talk about her as a feminist and a humanist. She's a Catholic. She goes to Mass every day. She has a sacramentalist conception of human beings. She has an incarnationist conception of human existence. The blood-soaked transubstantiation that takes place at the Eucharist for her spills over into community. That's why you don't have isolated individuals over against the world like Martin Luther against the Holy Roman Empire. You always have an ensemble, a community of women and a community of men and women together over against the world. That's profoundly Catholic. It goes back to an African called Augustine. And the European name Aquinas and so forth and so on. But this sense of tradition, of course, the centrality of Hans Georg Gadamer for me, who was my favorite philosopher of the 20th century, wrote a text called Truth and Method. It's all about how traditions are inescapable and unavoidable. All of us are shaped by traditions. And you think you made yourself. I guess you gave birth to yourself too. Taught yourself language. Okay, go on, sit down and make a fool of yourself. No, traditions are always already there. The question is, how do you interpret them? Traditions can suffocate, too narrow, dogmatic. Traditions can liberate, empowering in that way. And so that wrestling with the different traditions made a very, very important difference for me. And in terms of the Marxism, you see, as a Christian, I take seriously Ephesians 6. It's put on the whole armor. I'm looking for any form of spiritual, intellectual, moral weaponry that allows me to bear witness to a love that results from a grace I do not deserve. So if Marxism has a critique of class struggle and a critique of capitalist greed and wealth inequality, and it's truthful, I'm with it. If it moves toward repression and domination, I'm against it. If there's a Muslim like Malcolm who's telling the truth, I'm with that brother Muslim named Malcolm. If he says something like, white folk are devils, no, that's wrong. A lot of devilish behavior, interesting insight. No, white folk ain't devils. I know a whole lot of black thugs and gangsters. I was a gangster myself before I met Jesus. I'm just a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. But Malcolm told some deep truths as a Muslim. Bell Hooks, deep truths as a Buddhist, and so forth and so on. And then when it comes to the issue of the present church, I mean, we live in the most commodified culture in the history of the world, so we're going to get commodified religion. And that's precisely what we've seen. The sad thing is that the black church historically in its prophetic mode and the black freedom movement has been the leaven in the American democratic loaf. Once that bread of life goes stale, with folk more and more drunk with the wine of the world, to use the language of the Negro National Anthem, then rest be assured we're living in an empire of overwhelming spiritual decay and moral decrepitude in which people more and more no longer believe that keeping the faith is worth it. It's just all about making it, making it, making it. And once you pass that on to the younger generation, you have committed a crime against humanity. Because you have robbed them of the best of their tradition and their inheritance. It's like young folk not knowing who John Coltrane is. Not knowing who Art Tatum was. You robbed them of the best that's gone into it. And we're going to mention Jodeci too, because Jodeci can sing. Jodeci can sing. Church-based. I don't think they're Baptist, but we'll forgive them for that. They're Pentecostal. I love my, well, we Baptists. Certain founders are Pentecostals. But the point is this. That I'm blessed to be here. Wake Forest, thank you so much for this magnificent occasion.